On a warm summer evening in Houston, Texas, a mother of 3 went out for her usual jog and never came back. The next day, her body was found dumped in the woods, her life stolen in a crime so brutal it shocked the city. And standing at the center of it all was a man who would spend more than 2 decades fighting the justice system, only to meet his end inside Texas's most infamous prison. His name was Arthur Lee Burton, and his story is one of crime, denial, and a haunting final statement that left more questions than answers. And in this episode of Death Row Diaries, we're going to walk you through his entire journey, from his troubled upbringing to the night of the crime, through his long appeals, and finally, to his execution in 2024. And stay with us until the end, because we'll reveal his last meal and his cryptic last words before the lethal injection began. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Death Row Diaries. Arthur Lee Burton was born on March 29, 1970 in Bastrop, Louisiana. From the very start, his life was marked by instability and hardship. His father was often absent, leaving Arthur and his siblings to grow up in a home where poverty wasn't the exception, it was the rule. There were times when the family lived without food, without electricity, and sometimes without hope. Burton's childhood was a cycle of neglect and survival. Unlike many kids who could rely on stability at home, Arthur was forced into adulthood far too early. His brother Michael would later testify that Arthur never truly had a chance. By the time most boys were worried about school or sports, Arthur was already experimenting with drugs and drifting into the wrong crowds. At just 16 years old, Burton was using marijuana regularly. By 17, he was trafficking cocaine, a dangerous path that put him directly in the crosshairs of law enforcement. And by the age of 18, his criminal record exploded. In just a single month, Burton was involved in 39 burglaries, stealing everything from radios and calculators to fishing gear and guns. These weren't petty mistakes of a confused teenager. They were serious, calculated crimes, and they painted a clear picture of a young man spiraling out of control. But here's the paradox. Despite his growing rap sheet, those who knew Burton personally painted a very different image. His wife and mother described him as a hard-working man, someone who loved building things, someone who was good with his hands. He was a husband. He was a father to 3 children and a stepchild. To them, Arthur wasn't a monster, he was family. This contradiction between the family man and the career criminal would follow Burton throughout his life. It raised a haunting question: which Arthur Lee Burton was the real one? By the summer of 1997, Burton was 27 years old, living in Houston, Texas, and working as a cement finisher. His personal life seemed somewhat stable. He was married, he had children, and on the surface, he looked like any other working-class man trying to provide for his family. But beneath the surface, the same patterns of violence and crime were lurking. And on the night of July 29, 1997, those patterns came to light in the most horrifying way. That evening, 48-year-old Nancy Edelman went out for her regular jog along the trails near Bray's Bayou. She never made it home. The next day, police found her body in a wooded area. She had been beaten, assaulted, and strangled to death with her own shoelaces. The investigation quickly zeroed in on Burton. A witness had reported seeing an angry-looking man on a bicycle near Nancy's house around the time of her disappearance. The description matched Burton. 10 days after the murder, police brought him in for questioning. At first, Burton denied everything. He claimed he wasn't in the area, that he didn't even ride a bicycle there. But his story began to unravel under pressure. Police pointed out inconsistencies. They presented evidence that didn't match his version of events. And finally, Burton broke. He confessed. He admitted to kidnapping Nancy, attempting to assault her, and ultimately strangling her when she resisted. The confession was chilling, and it contained details only the killer would know. But later, Burton would retract everything. He claimed his confession was forced, that investigators had beaten him, threatened him, and pushed him into saying things he didn't mean. He insisted he was innocent. This would become a recurring theme throughout his legal battle. Burton trying to separate himself from his own words, from his own admission of guilt. Before we continue deeper into Burton's trial, let me pause here and ask, do you think a confession under pressure should be enough to convict someone for capital murder? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on it.
In October 1997, just a few months after the murder, Burton was formally indicted for capital murder. That charge meant prosecutors were seeking the death penalty. By June 1998, the trial was underway in Harris County, a place with a reputation for being one of the toughest death penalty districts in the country. At the time, Harris County alone had already been responsible for dozens of executions since the death penalty resumed in 1976. Prosecutors presented a clear narrative. Burton had spotted Nancy jogging, kidnapped her, tried to assault her, and killed her when she resisted. They pointed to his confession, the witness statements, and the brutal reality of the crime scene. Burton's defense told a very different story. They argued that the confession was coerced, that Arthur was an intellectually limited man, vulnerable to manipulation. They insisted there wasn't enough physical evidence tying him to the murder. But the jury didn't buy it. After deliberating, they found Burton guilty of capital murder, and on June 23, 1998, the same jury sentenced him to death. Just like that, Burton's fate was sealed, or so it seemed. What followed was a legal saga that would stretch on for more than 20 years. Burton's case bounced through courtrooms at every level, state, federal, even the U.S. Supreme Court. 2001. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction, but vacated the death sentence, ordering a new sentencing trial. 2002. At the retrial, a new jury once again handed Burton the death penalty. The defense begged for mercy, arguing his children still needed their father, even behind bars. The prosecution countered that his crime was so brutal, so senseless, that mercy was undeserved. 2004. The courts upheld the death sentence. 2008, 2009, 2012, 2013, 2014, appeal after appeal was filed, and one by one, they were denied. By this point, Burton's defense shifted focus. They argued that he should be exempt from execution because he was intellectually disabled. U.S. law prohibits executing individuals with intellectual disabilities. But prosecutors fired back with evidence that undermined this claim. They pointed out Burton's ability to read, write, and function at a level equal to or higher than the average American adult. A medical expert concluded that his skills were inconsistent with intellectual disability. Burton's last hope faded as the courts dismissed these claims. If you've been following Burton's journey so far, make sure you're subscribed to Death Row Diaries. We cover stories just like this every week, cases that test the boundaries of crime, punishment, and justice. Hit subscribe and join our growing community of true crime watchers. By 2024, Burton had spent more than 25 years on death row. Then came the date he could no longer escape, August 7th, 2024. In May of that year, a judge signed his death warrant. The clock was ticking. As his execution date approached, Burton's lawyers scrambled with last-minute appeals. They once again argued that he was intellectually disabled, citing medical reports. But just hours before the scheduled execution, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. It was over. Burton was transferred to the Huntsville unit, home to Texas's death chamber. He was given his last meal, a tradition in Texas executions, though the specific details were not made public in the official record. What we do know is that Burton refused anything extravagant, keeping his final request simple. That evening, he was led into the chamber. At 6:23 p.m., Burton was strapped to the gurney. Witnesses gathered, reporters, prison officials, and members of Nancy Edelman's family. When asked if he had any final words, Burton did speak. He apologized to Nancy's family, saying he was sorry for the pain his actions had caused, and then he added something strange, something that left people scratching their heads. He said, "Bird is going home." No one knew exactly what he meant. Was it a spiritual reference, a coded personal message to his family, or just the final words of a man trying to make sense of his own death? At 6:47 p.m., Burton was pronounced dead. He was the third inmate executed in Texas that year, and the 11th in the U.S. in 2024. His death came just hours before another execution, this time in Utah. Arthur Lee Burton is the story of contradictions, a man described by his family as a hard-working father, yet condemned by the courts as a cold-blooded killer. A man who confessed, then denied, who begged for mercy, then delivered cryptic last words as the lethal injection took his life. His journey raises difficult questions about justice, punishment, and redemption. Did the system get it right, or was Burton's life a tragedy of circumstance and failure long before the crime that sealed his fate? What do you think? Was Arthur Lee Burton a victim of his own troubled past, or did justice prevail in the end? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Death Row Diaries for more deep dives into the lives and final moments of America's most infamous death row inmates. This has been the story of Arthur Lee Burton, a man whose life began in hardship, spiraled into crime, and ended on a gurney in Huntsville, Texas. His last meal was simple, his last words mysterious. Bird is going home. Until next time, this is Death Row Diaries.